Picture yourself standing in the market square of Nuremberg on a cold October morning in 1532. The crowd around you is restless, pressing forward despite the rain that's been falling since dawn. Children are hoisted onto shoulders, merchants abandon their stalls, and even the nobility lean from their windows to witness what's about to unfold. At the center of this human tide stands a wooden scaffold, and beside it, a figure in black adjuster's hood checks the mechanisms of a device that would make even hardened soldiers turn away in horror. The condemned man being led forward is Franz Schmidt's 300th victim, though Franz prefers to think of them as patients. You see, Franz isn't just an executioner, he's also the town physician, a duality that perfectly captures the twisted logic of medieval justice, where the same hands that could heal were expected to methodically destroy human bodies in the name of law and order. What you're about to discover isn't just a catalogue of tortures, though the methods themselves will haunt your dreams. This is the story of how entire civilizations convinced themselves that public agony was not just acceptable, but necessary. How ordinary people became capable of extraordinary cruelty, and how the human body became a canvas for the most elaborate forms of suffering ever devised. If you find these hidden truths of history as fascinating as they are disturbing, consider subscribing to join our community of curious minds exploring the darkest corners of the past. Drop a comment letting me know what historical period intrigues you most. I'm always amazed by how our shared fascination with history's shadows brings us together from every corner of the globe. The device Franz Schmidt is preparing that morning is called the breaking wheel, and its very existence tells us something profound about medieval society's relationship with suffering. This wasn't a tool designed in a moment of rage or improvised in the heat of passion. The breaking wheel was carefully engineered, mathematically precise, with every spoke positioned to maximize both damage and duration. The condemned man's name was Hans Frischl, accused of murdering a pregnant woman during a robbery. His sentence wasn't just death, but death by degrees, each stage calculated to extract maximum suffering while keeping him conscious enough to experience the next phase. Franz begins by securing Hans to the wheel's outer rim, stretching his limbs along the spokes in a grotesque parody of Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. The crowd falls silent as Franz raises his iron bar, weighing exactly 12 pounds, polished to prevent rust that might cause premature death through infection. The first blow falls on Hans's right shin, the crack audible even over the rain. Franz is an expert. He knows exactly where to strike to shatter the bone without rupturing major arteries. Hans screams, but this is just the overture to a symphony of agony that will last hours. The breaking wheel wasn't unique to Nuremberg or even to Germany. Variations appeared across Europe from Scotland to Sicily, each region adding its own refinements to the basic concept. In France, they called it the roue, and executioners there developed a technique called the retentum, where victims were bent backward over the wheel's rim until their spine snapped. In some German states, merciful judges might specify that the condemned receive a blow to the chest after a certain number of limb breaks, a coup de grace that ended suffering more quickly. But mercy was rare, and most victims endured the full prescribed sequence. What made the breaking wheel particularly horrifying wasn't just the pain, but the spectacle. This was performance art in the most literal sense, with the executioner as both artist and instructor, demonstrating to the assembled crowd the consequences of transgression. Every broken bone was a lesson, every scream a warning. Parents would bring their children specifically to witness these events, believing that the horror would imprint moral lessons more effectively than any sermon. The scaffold wasn't hidden away in some dungeon, but elevated in the town's most public space, often near the church, creating a deliberate juxtaposition between divine mercy and earthly justice. But to truly understand medieval punishment, we need to step back from that rain-soaked scaffold and examine the worldview that made such spectacles not just possible, but routine. Medieval Europeans inhabited a universe where physical suffering held profound spiritual significance. Pain wasn't just punishment, but purification, a way to burn away sin before the soul faced divine judgment. The body was seen as inherently corrupt, a prison for the soul that needed to be disciplined, mortified, even destroyed to achieve salvation. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, but cruelty with cosmic purpose. Consider the case of Damien's the Regicide. Though his execution took place in 1757, well past the medieval period, it represented the culmination of centuries of refinement in the art of judicial suffering. Damiens had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France, and his punishment was designed to be the most elaborate and extended execution in European history. The sentence, read aloud in the Paris courthouse, specified that he would be taken to the Place de Grève, where the flesh would be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers. Molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and sulfur would be poured into the wounds. Then, his body would be drawn and quartered by 4 horses, and his limbs and body consumed by fire. The execution began at 2 in the afternoon. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, later wrote in his memoirs about the technical difficulties of the procedure. The horses, unaccustomed to such work, struggled to tear Damiens apart. After 2 hours of pulling, Sanson had to partially sever the joints with a knife to allow the quartering to proceed. Throughout this ordeal, Damiens remained conscious, lifting his head to look at his mangled body, his lips moving in what witnesses interpreted as either prayers or curses. He didn't die until past 6 in the evening, over 4 hours after the torture began. But spectacular executions like Damiens were actually relatively rare. Most medieval justice was administered through methods that were less theatrical but no less cruel. Take the pillory, for instance, that seemingly simple wooden frame that held a person's head and hands immobile. On its surface, it appears almost quaint compared to the breaking wheel or the rack. But the pillory's true horror lay not in the device itself, but in what it enabled. A person locked in the pillory was completely defenseless, exposed to whatever abuse the crowd chose to inflict. Rotten vegetables were the least of it. Contemporary accounts describe victims being pelted with stones, dead animals, human waste, and in winter having water thrown on them that would freeze, causing frostbite and gangrene. The case of Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, illustrates the pillory's psychological torture. In 1703, Defoe was pilloried for publishing a satirical pamphlet. He spent 3 days in the device, 1 day at each of 3 locations in London. While Defoe was relatively fortunate, with supporters protecting him from the worst abuse, he later wrote about the experience as one of complete helplessness and humiliation. The anticipation of each thrown object, the inability to protect oneself, the forced eye contact with hostile crowds, all combined to create a form of psychological torture that many considered worse than physical beatings. Women faced their own particular horrors in medieval punishment, often centered around crimes that challenged gender norms. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, was specifically designed for women accused of being too outspoken, gossiping, or nagging. This iron mask enclosed the head with a metal bit that pressed down on the tongue, making speech impossible and often causing severe lacerations. Women were forced to wear these devices in public, led through the streets like animals, a literal silencing that served as a warning to other women about the consequences of verbal assertiveness. The case of Agnes Waterhouse in 1566 shows how gendered punishment intersected with superstition and misogyny. Accused of witchcraft, Agnes faced not just execution, but a series of preliminary tortures designed to extract confession and identify accomplices. She was subjected to pricking, where every mole and blemish on her body was pierced with needles to find the devil's mark that supposedly wouldn't bleed or feel pain. She endured sleep deprivation, prevented from resting for days until hallucinations and exhaustion produced the confession her interrogators sought. The swimming test followed, where she was bound and thrown into water. If she floated, it proved she was a witch. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent but dead. The witch trials introduced a particularly insidious form of torture called the strappado. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, attached to a rope that ran through a pulley on the ceiling. They were then hoisted into the air, all their body weight hanging from their backward bent arms, dislocating shoulders and tearing muscles. Just when the pain became unbearable, they would be dropped part way, the jolt multiplying the agony. Weights might be attached to the feet to increase the damage. This could continue for hours, with rest periods not out of mercy, but to prevent the victim from losing consciousness. But perhaps no medieval punishment captures the intersection of creativity and cruelty quite like the Judas cradle. This pyramid-shaped seat was designed to slowly impale victims through the rectum or vagina as they were lowered onto its point. The condemned would be stripped naked, adding humiliation to agony, and sometimes weights would be attached to their legs to accelerate the process. The device's name, invoking the biblical betrayer, wasn't accidental. It was reserved for those whose crimes were seen as betrayals of the social order, including heretics, traitors, and those who violated sexual norms. The stories of those who endured the Judas cradle are largely lost to history, their names unrecorded, their suffering reduced to brief mentions in execution records. But we do have the account of one survivor, a man known only as Guillaume, who was subjected to the device in Lyon in 1423, but was removed before fatal damage occurred when new evidence emerged in his case. His testimony, preserved in church records, describes not just the physical agony, but the complete loss of human dignity, being displayed naked and penetrated before a watching crowd, reduced to an object of simultaneous horror and fascination. The medieval mind didn't see these punishments as barbaric. They were understood as necessary components of a divinely ordered society. The Swedish legal code of the 13th century explicitly stated that punishment should match the crime not just in severity, but in symbolic meaning. Thieves had their hands cut off because hands committed theft. Liars and blasphemers had their tongues cut out or pierced. Rapists were castrated. This wasn't random cruelty, but a complex system of symbolic justice where the punishment literally fit the crime. The case of François Ravaillac, who assassinated King Henry IV of France in 1610, demonstrates this symbolic logic taken to its extreme. His right hand, which held the knife that killed the king, was burned with sulfur. His chest was torn open with pincers, and molten lead was poured into the wounds. His body was then quartered, with each piece sent to different parts of the kingdom as a warning. Even after death, the punishment continued. His house was demolished, his family was exiled, and his name was formally cursed. This wasn't just about punishing Ravaillac, but about restoring the cosmic order his crime had disrupted. The rack, that most iconic of medieval tortures, operated on a deceptively simple principle. The victim was laid on a wooden frame with their ankles and wrists secured to rollers at opposite ends. As the rollers turned, the body was stretched until joints dislocated, muscles tore, and eventually limbs separated entirely. What made the rack particularly effective wasn't just the pain, but the slow, measurable progression of damage. Interrogators could precisely control the level of suffering, increasing tension incrementally while questioning the victim. The Tower of London's rack, known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, became legendary for its effectiveness. Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plotter, was subjected to it in 1605. His signature before and after the torture shows the extent of the damage. The first is firm and clear, the second barely legible, a shaky scrawl that suggests extensive nerve damage. Fawkes confessed everything his interrogators wanted to hear, though historians still debate how much of his confession was true and how much was simply saying whatever would make the torture stop. But focusing solely on the spectacular tortures risks missing the more mundane cruelties that characterized medieval justice. Most punishments were swift, brutal, and public. Flogging was the most common, with the number of lashes carefully prescribed by law: 30 lashes for petty theft, 50 for adultery, 100 for blasphemy. The whips themselves were often enhanced with metal tips or bones to increase damage. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Infection, blood loss, and shock killed many who received severe floggings. The autobiography of John Gerard, a Jesuit priest tortured in the Tower of London in 1597, provides one of the most detailed first-person accounts of medieval torture. Gerard was subjected to the manacles, hung by his wrists with his feet off the ground. He describes the initial pain as bearable, but as hours passed, the agony became indescribable. His shoulders dislocated, his wrists tore, and he began to hallucinate. What strikes modern readers about Gerard's account isn't just his suffering, but his psychological analysis of his torturers. He describes how they seem to take professional pride in their work, discussing techniques and comparing results like craftsmen perfecting their trade. The innovation never stopped. Medieval torturers constantly refined their methods, sharing techniques across Europe like recipes in a cookbook of cruelty. The Spanish boot, crushed feet and legs between iron plates tightened by screws. The thumbscrew compressed digits until bones shattered. The Iron Maiden, and that supposed medieval torture device with spikes that impaled victims when the door closed, was likely a later invention. But the fact that people believed it was medieval says something about how we understand that period's capacity for cruelty. One of the most psychologically devastating punishments was live burial. Reserved for those who violated fundamental taboos, particularly Vestal virgins in ancient Rome who broke their vows of chastity, this method combined suffocation with complete sensory deprivation. The victim was placed in a small underground chamber with a limited supply of food and water, not as mercy, but to maintain the legal fiction that they weren't being executed, but merely confined. They would die slowly in absolute darkness, their screams muffled by earth, experiencing a kind of living death that many considered worse than any torture. The case of Urbain Grandier illustrates how torture was used not just to punish, but to construct truth. Grandier, a French Catholic priest, was accused of witchcraft in 1634. His interrogators used the boots, crushing his legs until bones protruded through the skin, demanding he confess to making a pact with the devil. When Grandier maintained his innocence despite the agony, his torturers took this as proof of supernatural assistance, claiming the devil was helping him withstand the pain. This circular logic, where resistance to torture proved guilt just as surely as confession, trapped victims in an impossible situation. The medieval period also saw the development of specialized torture chambers, architectural spaces designed to maximize psychological terror. The castle of Nuremberg had a room called the Iron Virgin Chamber, painted entirely black, with no windows, where prisoners waited in complete darkness before their torture began. The anticipation, the inability to judge time, the sounds of other victims echoing through the walls, all served to break prisoners psychologically before any physical torture commenced. Water torture took many forms in medieval Europe, each exploiting different fears and physiological responses. The Dutch method involved forcing vast quantities of water into the victim's stomach through a funnel until internal organs were damaged. The Spanish toca covered the face with cloth and slowly dripped water onto it, creating the sensation of drowning while keeping the victim alive. The ordeal by water threw accused criminals into rivers or lakes, their survival or death interpreted as divine judgment of guilt or innocence. The case of Johannes Junius, mayor of Bamberg, provides one of the most complete records of systematic judicial torture. Arrested for witchcraft in 1628, Junius endured thumbscrews, leg vices, the strappado, and burning. His secret letter to his daughter, smuggled out of prison, describes not just the physical pain, but the psychological manipulation. His torturers alternated between extreme cruelty and false kindness, promising mercy if he confessed, threatening worse tortures if he didn't. Eventually, broken in body and spirit, Junius confessed to crimes he hadn't committed, naming accomplices he'd never met, participating in a fiction that would lead to his execution and the arrest of those he named. The economics of torture created its own perverse incentives. Executioners and torturers were paid by the job, creating financial motivation to find guilt. In many jurisdictions, the condemned's property was divided between the court, the accuser, and the executioner, making false accusations profitable. The torturer's assistant, who maintained the equipment, purchased supplies, and cleaned the chambers after each session, became a specialized trade passed from father to son, creating dynasties of professional torturers who refined techniques across generations. The pair of anguish represents the medieval tendency to create specialized tools for specific crimes. This device, inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina, depending on the crime, could be expanded by turning a screw, causing massive internal damage. It was used for liars, homosexuals, and women accused of adultery or witchcraft, the orifice chosen to match the perceived source of sin. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The device literally tore open the body part associated with the crime, making the punishment a grotesque literalization of the transgression. But not all medieval punishments involved elaborate devices. Sometimes simplicity was most effective. The ordeal by fire required accused criminals to carry red-hot iron bars or walk across burning plowshares. If their burns healed cleanly within 3 days, God had proclaimed their innocence. If infection set in, guilt was confirmed. This system created a particular kind of anticipatory torture, 3 days of watching wounds fester or heal, knowing that suppuration meant death. The medieval justice system also employed psychological torture through public humiliation. The stocks, similar to the pillory, but restraining feet instead of hands and head, positioned victims in deliberately degrading postures. The ducking stool plunged gossiping women repeatedly into rivers or ponds. The shock of cold water and near drowning combined with public mockery. These punishments left no permanent physical damage, but created lasting psychological trauma and social ostracism that could be worse than physical scarring. The case of Gilles de Rais, companion of Joan of Arc turned serial killer, shows how even nobility wasn't immune to torture when crimes were severe enough. Accused of murdering over 100 children, Gilles initially refused to confess, claiming his noble status exempted him from torture. But when threatened with excommunication, a fate worse than any physical torture for a medieval Christian, he confessed to crimes that shocked even hardened interrogators. His execution in 1440 became a public spectacle, with parents of victims given special viewing positions to witness justice being served. Medieval punishment also extended beyond death. The bodies of executed criminals were displayed on gibbets, iron cages that held corpses for months or years as they decomposed. Living criminals might be gibbeted too, dying slowly of exposure and dehydration while ravens pecked at their still-living flesh. The sight and smell of these hanging cages at crossroads and city gates served as constant reminders of justice's reach. Some gibbet cages were specially designed to keep bodies intact longer, treating the iron with compounds that prevented rust and shaped to support decomposing remains for maximum display time. The creativity of medieval punishment seemed limitless. Pressing, also called peine forte et dure, slowly crushed victims under increasing weights placed on boards laid across their bodies. This wasn't interrogation, but execution, by degrees, each added stone increasing pressure until ribs cracked and organs failed. The process could take days, with careful calculation ensuring consciousness persisted as long as possible. Witnesses described victims' eyes bulging from sockets, blood seeping from ears and nose, the grotesque transformation of human bodies into flattened remnants. Flaying alive, removing skin from living victims, required exceptional skill to keep subjects conscious throughout the process. Professional flayers knew which areas to avoid to prevent premature death from blood loss, how to prevent shock, when to pause to revive flagging consciousness. The Assyrians had perfected this technique centuries earlier, but medieval Europeans refined it into an art form. Judges might specify partial flaying, removing skin from specific body parts as symbolic punishment, leaving victims alive but permanently disfigured. The medieval period's relationship with punishment reveals fundamental truths about human nature and social control. These weren't acts of random sadism, but carefully calibrated displays of power, each torture method sending specific messages about authority, morality, and the consequences of transgression. The crowds who gathered to watch weren't just bloodthirsty mobs, but participants in a complex social ritual that reinforced community values through spectacular negative examples. Consider the execution of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham, lovers of Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Both men faced the full penalty for treason, but their executions differed based on social status. Culpeper, a gentleman, received the mercy of beheading. Dereham, of lower birth, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, his bowels removed while he still lived, his heart torn out and shown to the crowd. Even in death, social hierarchy was maintained through graduated suffering. The legacy of medieval punishment extends far beyond the period itself. These methods didn't simply disappear with the Renaissance, but evolved and migrated. Colonial powers exported European torture techniques worldwide, adapting medieval methods to new contexts. The psychological principles underlying medieval torture, using pain and humiliation to extract confession and enforce conformity, persist in modern interrogation techniques, even when physical torture is officially prohibited. The stories of those who endured these punishments mostly vanished into historical silence. We know the names of kings and torturers, of famous victims and notorious criminals, but thousands suffered and died anonymously, their agony reduced to brief entries in execution ledgers. Each was someone's child, parent, spouse, friend. Each felt the same terror we would feel facing such horrors. Their humanity transcends the centuries, reminding us that history isn't abstract, but composed of individual human experiences, many of them unspeakably horrible. What drove ordinary people to inflict such suffering on others? The executioners and torturers weren't monsters, but professionals, performing legally sanctioned duties. Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner mentioned at the beginning, kept a detailed diary of his career. He expressed pride in his skill, regret for some executions, professional satisfaction in others. He saw himself as a necessary component of social order, his violence serving justice and ultimately divine will. This rationalization, transforming cruelty into duty, enabled systematic torture to persist for centuries. The end of widespread judicial torture in Europe came not from sudden moral awakening, but from gradual shifts in philosophy, law, and social structure. Enlightenment thinkers questioned torture's effectiveness and morality. Legal reforms emphasized imprisonment over physical punishment. Most importantly, the public spectacle of suffering began to seem barbaric rather than instructive to increasingly sophisticated urban populations. The last official use of the breaking wheel in Europe was in 1841 in Prussia, though extrajudicial torture certainly continued long after. Modern readers might comfort themselves believing such cruelty belongs safely in the past, that human progress has moved us beyond such barbarity. But the psychological mechanisms that enabled medieval torture, the dehumanization of others, the justification of cruelty through ideology, the transformation of suffering into spectacle, remain present in human societies. Understanding medieval punishment isn't just historical curiosity, but a warning about human capacity for rationalized cruelty when power operates without restraint. The rain has stopped in that Nuremberg square. Hans Frischl's broken body has been displayed on the wheel for hours, his labored breathing the only sign of continuing life. The crowd has largely dispersed, returning to their daily routines, the spectacular suffering absorbed into ordinary life. Franz Schmidt cleans his tools methodically, preparing for tomorrow's work. Perhaps there will be a hanging, simpler and quicker, or perhaps another wheel, another demonstration of justice's terrible price. In medieval Europe, suffering wasn't aberration, but system, not exception, but rule, not madness, but method. The instruments of torture may gather dust in museums now, but the human capacity to inflict and rationalize suffering remains as present as ever, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge from the shadows of civilization we've built to contain it. The most horrifying aspect of medieval punishment wasn't the creativity of the torture or the duration of the suffering. It was the complete integration of such practices into everyday life, the transformation of human agony into routine administrative procedure. When suffering becomes systematic, when cruelty becomes professional, when torture becomes tradition, we witness the darkest capabilities of organized human society. The medieval period shows us this darkness in its full elaborate detail, a mirror reflecting capabilities we prefer to believe we've transcended, but which history suggests merely lie dormant, awaiting the right combination of fear, authority, and ideology to resurface in new forms. These stories from medieval Europe remind us that civilization is fragile, that the line between order and barbarity is thinner than we imagine, and that the human capacity for both suffering and inflicting suffering exceeds our comfortable modern comprehension. The tortured bodies displayed in medieval squares weren't just warnings to potential criminals, but monuments to the terrible arithmetic of power, where human pain becomes currency for social control. Understanding this history isn't just academic exercise, but essential recognition of what humans have done and, under the right circumstances, might do again. The past isn't past. It's prologue, warning, and mirror, reflecting capacities we carry within us still.